The laughter of the crowd was deafening, each chuckle and snide remark cutting deeper than the one before. Ryan stood there, frozen in humiliation, his cheeks burning as he clutched the hastily written love letter in his trembling hand. The note, which he'd poured his heart into, was now a crumpled mess lying on the cafeteria floor, trampled under the sneakers of indifferent onlookers. Across the room, Amber, the girl he had adored for years, leaned against a table, her arms crossed and a mocking smile playing on her lips. "Did you really think I'd ever go out with you?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room erupted in another round of laughter. Ryan's heart sank, the weight of embarrassment pressing down on his chest. He looked at her, searching for even a hint of kindness in her expression, but there was none. Her beauty, which he had admired from afar for so long, now seemed sharp and cold, like a polished blade. He turned and walked away, head bowed, the humiliation clinging to him like a second skin. That day, something inside Ryan broke, a fragile thread that held together his belief in kindness and fairness. For weeks, he replayed the scene in his mind, each time feeling the sting of Amber's words anew. People whispered about it in the hallways, their hushed tones and knowing glances reminding him he was now the subject of a cruel joke. Time passed, and Ryan withdrew from everyone. He stopped trying to fit in, stopped caring what anyone thought of him. But beneath the surface, he was plotting. He had no intention of staying the broken boy they all remembered. He started working on himself, not just physically, but mentally. Every workout at the gym, every late-night session reading books about confidence and persuasion, and every strategy he learned about building influence was a step toward his goal. Ryan was patient, willing to wait for the right moment. Revenge, after all, was best served cold. 2 years later, Ryan returned to his hometown, but he was no longer the shy, awkward boy everyone had once mocked. His transformation was remarkable. His once lanky frame was now athletic and confident, his quiet demeanor replaced by a calm self-assuredness. When he walked into the same coffee shop where Amber and her friends often hung out, heads turned. He noticed her immediately, sitting at her usual table, laughing with a new group of admirers. She hadn't changed much, still beautiful, still magnetic, but Ryan no longer felt the same pang of longing he once did. Instead, he felt something sharper, determination. Amber glanced up and noticed him. For a moment, her smile faltered as she tried to place his face. Ryan caught the flicker of recognition in her eyes, followed by confusion. He smiled, a polite, distant gesture, and turned to order his coffee. Amber couldn't help but stare. There was something familiar about him, but she couldn't quite figure it out. What she didn't know was that Ryan had been planning this encounter for months. He'd studied her habits, her routines, and the people she surrounded herself with. He had become an expert in reading people, understanding their vulnerabilities and desires. Amber, who once seemed untouchable, was no exception. As he sat at a table across the room, casually sipping his coffee, Ryan felt the weight of his plan coming into focus. He didn't want to hurt her, not physically, at least, but he wanted her to feel the same humiliation he had endured. He wanted her to realize that actions had consequences, and that sometimes, the people you dismiss can return to change everything. Amber stood up, her curiosity getting the better of her, and walked over to his table. "Do I know you?" she asked, her tone hesitant but intrigued. Ryan looked up, his expression calm and unreadable. "Maybe," he said with a small smile. "But the question is, do you want to?" Amber tilted her head, puzzled but intrigued. She couldn't have known that the man sitting before her was not the boy she had humiliated years ago. And she couldn't have known that the game had just begun. Amber hesitated, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of the table. There was something unsettlingly confident about Ryan's demeanor, something that made her want to sit down and keep the conversation going. She wasn't used to feeling unsure of herself, but something about him threw her off balance. With a quick glance back at her friends, she pulled out a chair and sat down. "So," she began, trying to regain her composure, "are you new in town? I don't think I've seen you around before." Ryan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady and calm. "Not exactly," he replied, his voice smooth and measured. "I've been away for a while, but I grew up here. Funny how some places never change." Amber tilted her head, studying him. There was something familiar about his face, but she couldn't pinpoint it. "Huh?" she said thoughtfully. "I guess a lot of people come and go. What brought you back?" Ryan's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. "Let's just say I had some unfinished business," he said. There was no malice in his tone, but the words lingered in the air like a subtle warning. Amber chuckled nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Mysterious, aren't you? What kind of unfinished business?" Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably in her seat. Finally, he said, "Just reconnecting with old acquaintances. Tying up loose ends. That sort of thing." Amber raised an eyebrow, unsure whether he was being vague on purpose or just naturally enigmatic. "Well," she said, trying to lighten the mood, "I hope you're not here to stir up trouble." "Trouble?" Ryan repeated, feigning innocence. "That doesn't sound like me." His eyes held hers for a moment too long, and Amber felt her pulse quicken. She glanced away, suddenly aware of how unnerved she felt. Meanwhile, Ryan was calculating every move. He knew her well enough to sense when she was uncomfortable, and he wasn't above using that to his advantage. But this wasn't the time to push too hard. He wanted her curiosity to grow, to draw her closer without her realizing she was stepping into his carefully laid trap. After a few more minutes of polite conversation, Amber excused herself, returning to her friends with a distracted look on her face. Ryan watched her go, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Phase 1 was complete, he had planted the seed of intrigue. Now, it was only a matter of time before she would come to him. Over the next few weeks, their paths began to cross more frequently. At first, it seemed coincidental, running into each other at the coffee shop, a chance encounter at the park, or a polite nod at the grocery store. Amber couldn't shake the feeling that these meetings weren't entirely accidental, but she found herself drawn to him nonetheless. Ryan was charming without being overbearing, mysterious without being aloof. He had a way of making her feel seen, which was something she hadn't realized she missed. One evening, at the insistence of her friends, Amber invited Ryan to join their group for drinks at a local bar. She told herself it was just to be polite, but deep down, she wanted to figure him out. Ryan accepted the invitation with a smile, and when he arrived, he seamlessly integrated himself into the group. He was charismatic and attentive, his humor disarming even the most skeptical of her friends. As the night wore on, Amber found herself sitting closer to him, her guard slowly crumbling. "You're full of surprises," she said, leaning in slightly. "I feel like I've known you forever, but I still can't figure you out." Ryan's smile widened, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite name. "Maybe that's the fun part," he said. "Sometimes it's better not to know everything right away." Amber laughed, but her curiosity only deepened. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of excitement, a spark that made her forget about everything else. What she didn't realize, however, was that Ryan had been waiting for this moment. Each step of their renewed connection had been carefully orchestrated, and he was now closer than ever to achieving his goal. As they left the bar that night, Amber turned to him and said, "We should hang out again sometime. Just the two of us." Ryan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I'd like that," he said simply. Amber smiled, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. He thought she was stepping into a budding romance, a chance to explore something new and exciting. But for Ryan, this was no love story. It was the beginning of the end, and Amber was walking straight into it without a clue. The days that followed blurred into a strange mix of anticipation and unease for Amber. Ryan was quickly becoming a part of her world, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling her. Whenever she tried to dig deeper, asking about his past or why he seemed to know so much about the town despite claiming he'd been gone for years, he skillfully diverted the conversation. It wasn't that he lied, he just never gave her more than she needed to hear. One afternoon, as they walked through the local park, Amber decided to press him again. "You're really good at avoiding questions," she said, nudging him playfully. "What's your deal, Ryan? Were you some kind of secret agent before you came back here?" Ryan laughed, a low, easy sound that made her heart flutter. "Nothing that exciting," he said. "Just a regular guy trying to figure things out like everyone else." "Come on," she persisted. "There has to be more to you than that. Where did you go? What did you do? People don't just disappear for 2 years and come back like it's nothing." Ryan stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. For a moment, Amber thought she'd pushed too far, but then he sighed and looked away. "It wasn't exactly by choice," he said quietly. "I left because I needed to get away, to start over. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is put distance between yourself and the past." Amber softened, sensing that this was as much as he was willing to share. "I get that," she said. "Sometimes you have to leave to figure out who you really are." Ryan looked at her then, his eyes searching hers as if trying to decide whether he could trust her. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "Something like that." Amber didn't press him further, but the conversation lingered in her mind long after they parted ways. There was a vulnerability in Ryan that she hadn't noticed before, a glimpse of something raw and unguarded. It made her want to know him even more, to peel back the layers and uncover the truth. What she didn't realize was that Ryan had been carefully calculating every move, every word, to draw her in just enough without revealing too much. Meanwhile, Ryan was grappling with his own emotions. He hadn't expected Amber to be so human. In his memories, she was always the cold, unfeeling girl who had crushed him without a second thought. But now, seeing her smile, hearing her laugh, and watching her genuine moments of kindness, he felt the edges of his resolve begin to blur. He reminded himself of why he'd come back, why he'd spent 2 years preparing for this moment. He couldn't let his emotions derail the plan. The truth was, Ryan hadn't left town simply to start over. He had left because he couldn't bear the weight of his humiliation. The laughter, the whispers, the way people looked at him with pity, it had all been too much. For months after the incident with Amber, he had sunk into a dark place, consumed by anger and self-doubt. But one night, as he sat in his small, cluttered room staring at the ceiling, something shifted. He realized that he had two choices: he could let that moment define him, or he could take control of his life and rewrite the story. And so, he left. He worked tirelessly to transform himself, physically, mentally, emotionally. He learned how to read people, how to use their own assumptions against them. He studied psychology, persuasion, and everything he could find about confidence and influence. By the time he returned, he was a completely different person. But the wound from that day in the cafeteria had never fully healed. It was a scar he carried with him, a constant reminder of why he had to finish what he started. As the weeks went by, Ryan and Amber grew closer. They spent hours talking, laughing, and sharing pieces of their lives, but Ryan always kept her at arm's length emotionally. He knew that the more she trusted him, the more devastating it would be when the truth finally came out. And Amber, despite her growing feelings for him, couldn't shake the sense that she didn't know the whole story. One evening, Amber invited Ryan to her apartment for dinner. It was a small, cozy space filled with mismatched furniture and personal touches, photos of her friends and family, a shelf of well-loved books, and a few plants that were just barely surviving under her care. As they sat on the couch after dinner, sipping wine and talking about everything and nothing, Amber found herself opening up in a way she hadn't with anyone in a long time. "You know," she said, staring at her glass, "I wasn't always this confident. In high school, I felt like I had to be perfect all the time. Like, if I wasn't the best at everything, people wouldn't care about me." Ryan listened intently, his expression unreadable. "That sounds exhausting," he said softly. "It was," Amber admitted. "And I wasn't always nice. I said and did things I'm not proud of. I guess I thought that if I made people laugh, even if it was at someone else's expense, they'd like me more. But it didn't make me happy. Not really." Her words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he was back in that cafeteria, clutching his crumpled love letter while everyone laughed. He wanted to tell her, to make her see how much she had hurt him. But he didn't. Instead, he said, "We all make mistakes. What matters is whether we learn from them." Amber smiled, a small, wistful smile that made her look almost vulnerable. "I'd like to think I have," she said. "But sometimes I wonder if it's too late to make things right." Ryan's chest tightened. He wanted to believe she was sincere, that she had changed, but part of him still clung to the anger and hurt that had fueled him for so long. He knew he was at a crossroads. He could keep going, push forward with his plan and make her feel the pain he had felt. Or he could let it go, leave the past behind and allow himself to move on. But forgiveness wasn't something that came easily to Ryan. Not after everything he had been through. As Amber leaned closer, her head resting on his shoulder, Ryan stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for. All the pieces were falling into place. Yet, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to go through with it. Amber sighed contentedly, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. "I'm glad you came back," she said quietly. "I feel like I've been waiting to meet someone like you for a long time." Ryan closed his eyes, her words echoing in his mind. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to care. But as much as he tried to convince himself otherwise, he couldn't deny the truth: Amber had become more than just a target. And that made everything infinitely more complicated. As the weeks passed, Ryan found himself entangled in a web of emotions he hadn't anticipated. Amber's walls continued to crumble as she let him into her life, piece by piece, sharing stories about her childhood, her dreams, and even her regrets. It wasn't just that she seemed different from the girl who had humiliated him 2 years ago, it was that she seemed real. The person sitting across from him during their late-night talks, laughing at his jokes or leaning on his shoulder during a quiet moment, didn't match the cold, heartless image he had clung to for so long. But Ryan didn't let himself forget the pain. He couldn't. Every time he thought about softening, he would replay the day in the cafeteria in his mind, letting the anger reignite. He reminded himself that Amber's kindness now didn't erase what she had done. People didn't just change overnight, and Ryan wasn't naive enough to think her transformation was complete. If anything, her growing attachment to him made his plan even more effective. The higher she climbed, the harder the fall. Amber, on the other hand, was falling fast. She hadn't expected to feel this way about anyone, especially not Ryan. Something about him made her feel safe and seen in a way that was almost unnerving. She caught herself glancing at her phone during the day, hoping for a text, or thinking about their conversations long after they ended. Her friends noticed the change in her too. "You've been smiling a lot lately," her best friend Clara teased one evening. "Let me guess, Ryan?" Amber laughed, a little embarrassed. "Maybe," she admitted. "He's just different. You know? Like, he actually listens. And he doesn't play games. I feel like I can be myself around him." Clara raised an eyebrow. "That's great, Amber, but are you sure you know him? I mean, he just sort of showed up out of nowhere. Don't you think that's a little strange?" Amber waved off the concern. "People can change, Clara. Just because he wasn't here for a while doesn't mean he's hiding something. He told me he needed time to figure things out, and I respect that." Clara didn't push the issue, but her unease lingered. There was something about Ryan that didn't sit right with her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Amber, however, was too caught up in the whirlwind of her feelings to notice. One night, as they sat in Ryan's car overlooking the city skyline, Amber finally worked up the courage to ask him about something that had been on her mind for weeks. "Ryan," she began, her voice tentative, "why did you really come back?" Ryan didn't answer right away. He stared out at the lights below, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Amber waited, her heart pounding in the silence. Finally, he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever feel like the past has a way of pulling you back, no matter how far you try to run?" he asked. Amber blinked, taken aback by the question. "I guess," she said slowly. "But isn't the point of moving forward to leave the past behind?" Ryan smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Sometimes," he said, "the only way to move forward is to confront what's behind you." Amber frowned, sensing a heaviness in his words that she didn't fully understand. "Is that why you're here? To confront something?" Ryan nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Something like that." Amber wanted to press him for more, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It was as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between two worlds. She reached out and placed her hand on his, hoping to ground him. "Whatever it is," she said softly, "you don't have to face it alone." Ryan's heart twisted at her words. For a brief, fleeting moment, he considered telling her everything, about the humiliation, the anger, the plan. But then he thought about how she had laughed at him, how she had made him feel small and insignificant in front of everyone. That memory was a scar he couldn't ignore. Instead, he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. "Thanks, Amber," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That means a lot." The moment felt heavier than either of them expected, and the drive back to Amber's apartment was filled with a tense silence. When they arrived, Amber hesitated before getting out of the car. "Ryan," she said, her voice hesitant, "I know you're holding back. And I don't want to push you, but I just want you to know that you can trust me." Ryan smiled at her, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know," he said simply. "Good night, Amber." As she walked up the steps to her building, Ryan watched her go, his emotions warring inside him. He had come so far, put so much into this plan. But now, he wasn't sure if he could follow through. Amber wasn't who he thought she was, not anymore, at least. But then again, maybe she hadn't changed at all. Maybe this was just another game, another performance. He clenched his jaw, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. No, he couldn't afford to second-guess himself. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about justice. And if Amber had truly changed, then she would understand that some wrongs couldn't be undone. As the night deepened, Ryan drove away, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Unbeknownst to Amber, the threads of their connection were tightening, drawing her deeper into a web she couldn't yet see. And Ryan, caught between his growing feelings and the ghost of his past, was slowly realizing that no matter how this ended, Neither of them would walk away unscathed. Ryan's mind raced as he drove through the quiet streets, the dim glow of streetlights streaking across his windshield. His plan had been so clear, so focused, but now it felt like everything was unraveling. Amber wasn't supposed to be like this, kind, remorseful, even vulnerable. She wasn't supposed to look at him with such trust in her eyes, as if she truly believed he could be the person she needed. That trust was a weapon, one he'd planned to wield against her, but now it felt heavier than he had anticipated. He parked his car on the side of an empty street, resting his head against the steering wheel. What was he doing? He had spent 2 years preparing for this, carefully crafting a strategy to ensure she would understand the pain she'd caused. But the closer he got to her, the more he questioned whether revenge would bring him the closure he craved. Ryan thought back to the humiliation he had endured, the laughter, the whispered insults that seemed to follow him everywhere, the way Amber had smirked as if he didn't matter. It had felt like his entire world collapsed that day, and for so long, he had clung to the hope that making her feel the same way would set him free. But now, he wasn't so sure. Amber, oblivious to the storm brewing within Ryan, lay awake in her bed that night, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was holding something back, but she didn't know how to approach it without scaring him away. She thought about how different he was from anyone she'd met before, reserved yet confident, mysterious yet open in moments when it mattered. He had this way of making her feel seen, even when he was the one who kept parts of himself hidden. She reached for her phone, scrolling through old photos from high school. A particular one caught her eye, a group picture taken during senior year. There she was in the middle, laughing, surrounded by friends. And there, near the edge of the frame, was Ryan. She hadn't noticed him back then, hadn't even known his name until the day everything fell apart. But now, as she stared at his younger self, she saw something she hadn't before, a quiet loneliness in his eyes, a subtle tension in his posture. It made her chest tighten with guilt. She didn't remember all the details of that day in the cafeteria, but she knew enough to realize she had played a part in his pain. And now, all these years later, she wondered if she could ever make it right. The next morning, Amber decided to reach out to someone she hadn't spoken to in a while, her friend Clara, the only person who seemed even remotely skeptical about Ryan. As they sat at their favorite coffee shop, Amber hesitated, unsure how to start the conversation. "Do you think people can really change?" she asked finally, stirring her latte absently. Clara tilted her head, studying her friend. "Depends on the person," she said. "Why? Are you talking about Ryan?" Amber nodded. "He's different. I mean, he's not like anyone I've ever met. But sometimes I feel like there's this wall between us, like he's hiding something." Clara frowned, leaning closer. "Amber, you need to be careful. I've been doing some thinking, and something about this whole situation just doesn't sit right with me. He shows up out of nowhere, inserts himself into your life, and now you're falling for him without knowing anything about his past?" Amber sighed. "I know how it looks, but he's not like that. He's been through a lot, Clara. He just needs time." Clara didn't look convinced. "Just promise me you'll keep your eyes open, okay? People aren't always what they seem." Meanwhile, Ryan was beginning to feel the cracks in his plan. Every time Amber smiled at him, every time she opened up about her insecurities or shared a piece of her past, it became harder to see her as the enemy. He tried to remind himself of the pain she had caused, the way her actions had shattered his confidence and pushed him into isolation. But as much as he wanted to hold on to that anger, it was slipping through his fingers like sand. One evening, as Ryan sat in his apartment going over the next step of his plan, his phone buzzed. It was Amber. "Can we talk?" the message read. His heart sank. He wasn't sure he could keep this up much longer, but he couldn't afford to stop now. Not when he was so close. They met at a quiet park near Amber's apartment, the air cool and crisp under a blanket of stars. Amber looked nervous, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her jacket. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's stomach tightened. "And?" he prompted, his tone carefully neutral. Amber hesitated, looking down at the ground. "I feel like I've done things in the past that I'm not proud of. Things that hurt people, even if I didn't mean to. And if I've ever hurt you, Ryan, I want to make it right." Her words hit him like a blow, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. She was giving him an opening, a chance to tell her everything, to lay it all out in the open. But the weight of his plan loomed over him, the years of preparation and anticipation for this very moment. Could he really let it all go? Instead of answering, he reached out and took her hand. "Amber," he said quietly, "we've all made mistakes. What matters is that we try to be better." Amber looked up at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "I'm trying," she said. "I really am." Ryan nodded, forcing a smile. "I know." But as he walked her back to her apartment that night, his mind was in turmoil. He had spent so long building this elaborate game, setting the pieces in place to ensure Amber would feel the same pain he had. But now, standing on the brink of revenge, he realized he might have underestimated the cost. Because no matter what he did next, someone was going to get hurt, and he wasn't sure if he could live with the consequences. The days that followed were a blur of mixed emotions for Ryan. He found himself caught in a suffocating tug-of-war between his plans for revenge and the growing connection he felt with Amber. Every interaction with her chipped away at the armor he had carefully constructed over the years. She wasn't the same person who had humiliated him, at least, she didn't seem to be. But could he really trust that? Could someone like Amber truly change, or was this just another act in a long line of manipulations? Amber, too, felt the weight of the tension between them. She noticed how Ryan would sometimes pull away, retreating into himself at the most unexpected moments. It was like he was carrying a secret too heavy to share, and she didn't know how to reach him. She wanted to break through that wall, to understand what he wasn't telling her, but every time she tried, he would deflect with a smile or a vague answer that only left her more confused. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner together, Amber decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. As they walked back to her apartment, she stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "Ryan," she said, her voice firm, "I need you to be honest with me. What's going on?" Ryan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he knew exactly what she was referring to. Amber crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "You're holding something back. I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. And if we're going to keep doing this, whatever this is, I need to know the truth." For a moment, Ryan considered telling her everything. He could feel the words bubbling up inside him, the urge to lay bare the pain and anger that had driven him for so long. But then he thought about the risk. What if she didn't respond the way he expected? What if she denied everything, or worse, laughed at him again? The thought made his stomach churn. "I'm just dealing with some things," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "It's not about you. I promise." Amber didn't look convinced. "That's not good enough," she said, her tone softer now but still resolute. "I want to help you, Ryan. But I can't do that if you keep shutting me out." Ryan looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't think you can help with this," he muttered. Amber reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Try me." Ryan flinched at her touch, his resolve faltering. He couldn't keep this up much longer, not without risking everything. But instead of confessing, he took a step back, putting distance between them. "I need some time," he said, his voice tight. "I just need to figure things out." Amber nodded slowly, though her expression was tinged with disappointment. "Okay," she said quietly. "But don't take too long. I don't want to lose you." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and for a moment, Ryan felt like he was drowning. She cared about him, maybe even loved him. And that made what he was doing all the more difficult. But he couldn't stop now. Not yet. As the days turned into weeks, Ryan threw himself deeper into his plan, trying to silence the doubts gnawing at him. He began to manipulate situations subtly, planting seeds of uncertainty in Amber's life. He distanced her from her friends, subtly suggesting that they didn't understand her the way he did. He played the role of the perfect confidant, all while setting the stage for the final act of his revenge. But the more he pushed forward, the harder it became to reconcile his actions with the person he was becoming. He found himself questioning not just Amber's character, but his own. Was he any better than the person who had hurt him so deeply? Or had his need for revenge turned him into something worse? Meanwhile, Amber started to notice the cracks in their relationship. Ryan's mood swings became more frequent, and his once endearing mysteriousness began to feel like a barrier she couldn't breach. She confided in Claire one afternoon, her voice tinged with frustration and sadness. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I care about him so much, but it feels like he's slipping away." Clara frowned, her concern evident. "Amber, I hate to say it, but maybe Ryan isn't the person you think he is. People don't just show up out of nowhere and sweep you off your feet without a reason. Are you sure he doesn't have some kind of agenda?" Amber shook her head, though doubt flickered in her eyes. "I don't want to believe that. He's been through so much." Him under their enormity. Amber reached out, placing her hand over his. "Whatever it is, Ryan, you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here for you." Her touch was warm, comforting. and it made his chest ache with a mix of guilt and longing. For a moment, he considered telling her everything, the humiliation, the anger, the years of plotting his revenge. But then he thought of the look on her face if she knew the truth, the betrayal in her eyes when she realized what he had been planning all along. He couldn't do it. Not yet. Instead, he pulled his hand away, standing abruptly. "I need some air," he muttered, avoiding her gaze as he headed for the door. Amber watched him go, her heart sinking. She had thought tonight would bring them closer, but instead, it felt like they were drifting further apart. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break, that whatever was brewing inside Ryan was bigger than she could handle. Outside, Ryan leaned against the railing of her apartment building, staring out into the night. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had come so far, done so much to get to this point. He couldn't back out now, not after everything. But the thought of going through with it made him feel hollow, like he was losing a part of himself he wasn't sure he could ever get back. As he stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from someone he hadn't expected to hear from, Clara. "We need to talk. It's important." Ryan's blood ran cold. He had always been careful to stay under the radar, to keep his true intentions hidden. But Clara had been suspicious from the start, and now it seemed she was ready to act on those suspicions. He knew he couldn't ignore her. The next day, Ryan met Clara at a small cafe on the edge of town. She greeted him with a wary look, her arms crossed as she leaned back in her chair. "I'm going to cut to the chase," she said. "I don't know what your deal is, but I don't trust you. And I don't think Amber should either." Ryan forced a smile, though his heart was pounding. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice calm. Clara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb. I've been looking into you, and there are things that don't add up. Like why you suddenly showed up in Amber's life out of nowhere. Or why you're so vague about your past." Ryan felt a surge of panic, but he kept his expression neutral. "Amber and I are happy," he said. "I don't see why that's any of your business." Clara's jaw tightened. "It's my business because she's my friend, and I care about her. If you're hiding something, Ryan, I will find out. And when I do, I'll make sure Amber knows exactly who you are." Ryan didn't respond. He simply stood, throwing a few bills on the table before walking away. But Clara's words echoed in his mind long after he had left the cafe. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, Ryan stared at the photos and notes he had collected over the years, the evidence of Amber's betrayal, the reminders of the humiliation he had suffered. He had built his entire life around this moment, but now, as the pieces began to fall into place, he wasn't sure he could go through with it. He thought about Amber's smile, her laughter, the way she had opened up to him despite her own fears and insecurities. He thought about Clara's warning, the thinly veiled threat that she would expose him if he didn't act soon. And for the first time, Ryan wondered if revenge was worth losing everything he had come to care about. But before he could make a decision, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Amber. "I need to see you. It's urgent." Ryan's heart sank as he read the words. He had a sinking feeling that whatever was coming next would change everything, for better or worse. Ryan stared at the message, his hands trembling. The weight of everything, his plans, his guilt, his confusion, settled heavily on his chest. He couldn't ignore Amber's urgency, but the fear of what she might say gnawed at him. He typed a quick response. "I'll be there soon." The drive to Amber's apartment felt longer than usual. Every red light, every stop sign, seemed like another opportunity for his thoughts to spiral. What did she want to talk about? Did Clara already say something? Was this the moment everything unraveled? When he arrived, Amber was waiting at the door. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried a weight he couldn't ignore. She stepped aside to let him in without saying a word, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Amber, what's going on?" Ryan asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked to the small dining table and picked up a folded piece of paper. "This was in my mailbox today," she said, handing it to him. Ryan unfolded the paper, his stomach tightening as he read the typed words. "Do you really know who Ryan is? Ask him about the night 2 years ago. Ask him why he's really here." His blood ran cold. Someone had exposed him, or at least, part of him. He didn't have to guess who it was. Clara had made her move. Ryan looked up, his face a careful mask. "Amber, don't lie to me," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "I want the truth, Ryan. All of it. What happened 2 years ago? Why are you here?" He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain without destroying everything? He had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times, but now that it was here, nothing felt right. "Amber, please," he started, his voice low. "I need you to trust me." "How can I trust you when you've been hiding something this big?" She shot back, tears welling in her eyes. "I've let you into my life, into my heart, and now I find out you've been keeping secrets from me? Do you have any idea how that feels?" Her words cut deeper than he expected. Ryan had anticipated anger, maybe even accusations, but the pain in her voice was unbearable. He could see the cracks forming, the trust between them shattering piece by piece. 2 years ago, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was a different person. I was hurt, humiliated. By someone I thought I cared about. Someone who made me feel like I was nothing." Amber's eyes searched his face, her expression softening slightly. "Who was it?" Ryan hesitated, his chest tightening. This was it, the moment he had to choose between the truth and the lies he had built around him. But before he could answer, Amber's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the tension. She glanced at the screen and froze. "It's Clara," she said, her voice laced with hesitation. Ryan felt his stomach drop. He knew what Clara would say, what she was likely calling to reveal. He watched as Amber picked up the phone, her hand trembling slightly. "Clara?" Amber said, her voice wavering. Ryan listened in silence, his heart pounding as Amber's expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally, to something he couldn't quite read. When she hung up, the silence was deafening. She turned to Ryan, her face pale. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Did you come here for revenge?" Ryan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. There was no point in denying it now. "Yes," he said, the word hanging heavily in the air. "But it's not what you think." Amber took a step back, her eyes brimming with tears. "Then tell me what it is, Ryan, because right now, I feel like I don't even know you." Ryan's mind raced, desperate to find the right words. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain the pain he had carried for so long, the anger that had driven him to this point. But as he looked at her, standing there with tears streaming down her face, he realized that no explanation would ever be enough. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said finally, his voice cracking. "I never meant to hurt you, Amber. I didn't know how to stop." Amber shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You didn't know how to stop? Ryan, you lied to me. You manipulated me. And for what? To make me pay for something I don't even remember doing?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had convinced himself that his plan was justified, that Amber deserved to feel the same pain he had felt. But now, faced with the reality of what he had done, he wasn't so sure. "Amber, please," he said, taking a step toward her. "I know I messed up, but Stop," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "I can't do this right now. I need time to think." Ryan watched helplessly as she walked to the door, her shoulders trembling. She opened it, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "You should go." He wanted to argue, to plead with her to give him a chance to make things right. But he knew he had no right to ask for that. So he nodded silently and walked out, the door closing behind him with a finality that made his chest ache. As he stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door, Ryan felt the weight of everything he had done crashing down on him. The revenge he had spent years planning had led him to this moment, and now, he wasn't sure if he had lost the one thing he hadn't realized he truly wanted. Ryan sat in his car outside Amber's apartment, the silence inside deafening. He replayed the conversation over and over, searching for the moment he could have said something, anything, that might have changed how it ended. But no matter how many times he tried to untangle the mess, the conclusion remained the same: he had pushed too far and shattered everything in the process. He started the engine and drove aimlessly through the city, his mind clouded with regret. He didn't even notice where he was going until the neon sign of a familiar diner flickered into view. It was the same place he had come to countless nights during his lowest moments, a haven where no one asked questions and the coffee flowed endlessly. Inside, he found a corner booth and ordered a black coffee. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, gave him a knowing look as she set the cup in front of him. "Rough night?" she asked. "You could say that," Ryan replied, offering a faint smile in return. As he stared into the steaming mug, his phone buzzed on the table. He hesitated before picking it up, half expecting another message from Clara or Amber. But the name on the screen stopped him cold. "Unknown number." Ryan's thumb hovered over the answer button. He debated ignoring it, but something about the timing felt deliberate. Reluctantly, he answered. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a voice he hadn't heard in years. "Ryan. It's been a while." His heart skipped a beat. The voice belonged to Mark, his former best friend, and one of the key players in the night that had ruined his life. "What do you want?" Ryan asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "I heard about what you've been up to," Mark said, his voice calm but laced with something Ryan couldn't quite place. "You've been busy." Ryan's grip on the phone tightened. "How do you know anything about my life?" "Let's just say I have my ways," Mark replied. "And I think we need to talk. In person. Why would I ever want to see you again?" Ryan spat, his anger flaring. "Because I have information you'll want to hear. About Amber. About the past. About everything." Ryan's breath caught. He didn't trust Mark, he never had, even when they were friends. But the way he spoke, with such certainty, made Ryan pause. He had spent so long trying to piece together what had happened that night, to understand why he had been singled out, and now Mark was dangling answers in front of him. "Fine," Ryan said reluctantly. "Where?" Mark gave him an address on the outskirts of town, an abandoned warehouse that sounded more like a trap than a meeting place. But Ryan didn't care. If there was even a chance of getting the closure he needed, he was willing to take the risk. The warehouse was dark and foreboding, its broken windows casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. Ryan parked his car and stepped out, the cool night air sending a chill down his spine. He pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. Mark was waiting for him near the center of the room, leaning casually against a rusted table. He looked older, wearier, but the smirk on his face was the same as ever. "Glad you could make it," Mark said, his tone mocking. "Get to the point," Ryan replied, crossing his arms. Mark chuckled, pushing off the table and pacing slowly. "Still impatient, huh? Fine. Let's talk about Amber." Ryan stiffened at the mention of her name. "What about her?" Mark stopped and turned to face him, his expression suddenly serious. "You think she's the one who hurt you, who humiliated you? But what if I told you she wasn't the real villain in your story?" Ryan's mind raced. "What are you talking about?" "Amber didn't send that video, Ryan," Mark said, his voice low. "I did." The words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. He took a step back, his head spinning. "You're lying," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Why would I lie about something like that?" Mark shot back. "I hated how perfect you always seemed, how everyone loved you. So when I saw an opportunity to knock you down a peg, I took it." Ryan's fists clenched at his sides. "You destroyed my life. You let me believe it was her all this time." Mark shrugged, his smirk returning. "And you let yourself believe it. You wanted someone to blame, and she was an easy target." Ryan's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. The betrayal, the anger, the years of plotting his revenge, it had all been based on a lie. And now, the man who had orchestrated it stood before him, unapologetic and smug. "You're a coward," Ryan said through gritted teeth. "Maybe," Mark replied. "But I'm also right. You've spent all this time chasing revenge, and for what? To ruin someone who had nothing to do with it?" Ryan felt his anger boiling over, but beneath it was something else, a deep, aching regret. He had let his pain blind him, had built his entire life around a false narrative. And now, he wasn't sure how to undo the damage he had caused. Mark stepped closer, his voice low. "The question is, what are you going to do now?" Ryan didn't have an answer. For the first time in years, he felt truly lost. Ryan stared at Mark, his mind a chaotic swirl of emotions. Anger coursed through his veins, but it was tangled with confusion, regret, and a sickening realization of how far off track his life had veered. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd done, was built on Mark's deception. "What am I going to do?" Ryan repeated, his voice sharp and bitter. "I should ask you the same thing. Why now? Why tell me this after all these years?" Mark leaned back against the table, crossing his arms. "Because you were spiraling. It was entertaining at first, watching you self-destruct. But then, I started to wonder just how far you'd go. And honestly, I didn't think you'd make it this far. You've gotten dangerous." "Dangerous?" Ryan's laugh was cold and humorless. "You think I'm dangerous? You don't get to act like the victim here, Mark." Mark shrugged, his calm demeanor infuriating. "I'm not saying I didn't play my part. But you've taken things to a whole new level, my friend. You've hurt people who didn't deserve it. Amber, for one. You think she'll ever forgive you for this?" The mention of Amber hit Ryan like a dagger to the heart. The image of her tear-streaked face as she told him to leave was seared into his mind. He'd pushed her away, all because he was chasing revenge for a wound she hadn't even caused. "You don't know anything about Amber," Ryan snapped, his voice rising. "Oh, I know more than you think," Mark said, his smirk fading. "Amber's not who you think she is, either. Did you really think she was some innocent bystander? Sure, she didn't send that video, but she knew about it. She didn't stop it. She didn't even try. She let it happen because it was easier than standing up for you." Ryan froze, his mind reeling. "You're lying," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Am I?" Mark tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You've spent all this time blaming the wrong person, but the truth is, everyone betrayed you. Even her. You think she's the angel in all of this? She's not. She's just as complicit as anyone else." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to believe Mark, but doubt crept in like a shadow, darkening everything. Could Amber have known? Could she have stood by while his life fell apart? "I don't believe you," Ryan said finally, his voice shaking. Mark sighed, as if disappointed. "Believe what you want. But if you really want the truth, you need to ask her yourself. Dig a little deeper, Ryan. You'll find more skeletons in Amber's closet than you're ready for." Before Ryan could respond, Mark pushed off the table and started toward the exit. "One more thing," he said, glancing back over his shoulder. "Whatever you decide to do next, make sure it's worth it. You're running out of people to burn." With that, Mark disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ryan alone in the empty warehouse. The silence was deafening, the weight of Mark's words pressing down on him like a vice. Ryan's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. He scrolled to Amber's number, his thumb hovering over the call button. Every instinct told him to confront her, to demand answers, but fear held him back. What if Mark was right? What if Amber had betrayed him, too? Instead, he shoved the phone back into his pocket and stormed out of the warehouse, his mind racing. He needed to know the truth, but not from Amber. Not yet. If Mark was lying, he'd find a way to prove it. And if he wasn't? Ryan clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up once again. If Amber had been part of his downfall, he would make sure she faced the consequences. But first, he needed proof. The drive back to his apartment was a blur, his thoughts spinning in a relentless loop. He barely noticed the city lights flashing past or the rain beginning to fall. By the time he reached his building, his clothes were damp, and his head was pounding. Inside, he went straight to his computer. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he searched for anything, old social media posts, messages, photos, that might connect Amber to the events of that night. Hours passed, the glow of the screen illuminating his tired, determined face. And then, he found it. Buried deep in an old group chat from years ago, a message caught his eye. It was from Amber, dated the day after the video had gone viral. "I didn't mean for it to get so out of hand. I thought it was just a joke. I didn't think it would ruin everything." Ryan stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. The words were vague, but they were enough to send his mind into overdrive. Was this her admitting guilt? Was it her way of absolving herself of responsibility? He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. The cracks in his carefully constructed narrative were growing wider, and he wasn't sure how much more he could take. If Amber had known, if she had played even a small part in his humiliation, then everything between them was built on a lie. And if that were true, he would have to confront her, no matter the cost. Ryan sat in the dim light of his apartment, the weight of his discovery heavy on his chest. His hands trembled as he stared at Amber's message on the screen, reading it over and over again. The words felt like an admission of guilt, but they were so vague, so filled with uncertainty, that he couldn't decide if they confirmed his suspicions or if they were just another half-hearted excuse. He had to know the truth. He had to hear it from her. Face to face. With determination burning in his chest, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the apartment. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with tension, mirroring the storm that had been brewing in his mind for days. His steps were hurried, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of anger, betrayal, and desperation. He knew what he had to do, and there was no turning back now. Amber's apartment building loomed ahead, the familiar setting now tainted by everything he had discovered. He rang the buzzer, his finger hovering over the button for what felt like an eternity. When Amber's voice crackled through the speaker, he barely registered the words she said before he buzzed himself in. Her door opened with a hesitant creak, and she stood there in front of him, looking as if she had been expecting this moment. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a mix of apprehension and regret. "Ryan," she said softly, her voice almost breaking. "I knew you'd come. I just didn't think it would be like this." Ryan's heart raced as he stepped inside, his gaze fixed on her. "I've spent so much time trying to understand what happened between us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've realized it wasn't just Mark. It was you too. You let everything happen. You stood by and watched as I was humiliated." Amber flinched as if his words physically struck her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she looked small, broken. "I never meant for any of it to go that far, Ryan," she finally whispered. "You have to believe me. I was scared. I thought you'd hate me if I told you the truth." "The truth?" Ryan repeated, the sting of betrayal making his voice sharp. "What truth? That you knew and still didn't do anything?" Amber's face crumpled, her tears falling freely now. "I didn't know it would go public like that. I never wanted to hurt you. But Mark, he had a hold on me. He threatened me, Ryan. I was just trying to survive." Ryan's anger flared again, but something in Amber's voice softened the edges of his fury. "What do you mean, he had a hold on you? You're telling me you didn't have a choice?" She looked away, ashamed. "He knew things about me. About my family. Things that would have destroyed me if they came out. He made me stay quiet, made me pretend I didn't know about the video. I thought if I just kept quiet, everything would blow over." Ryan's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The truth was even darker than he'd imagined. Mark hadn't just manipulated him, he'd manipulated Amber too. She wasn't just a bystander, she was a victim in her own way, trapped by the same monster who had ruined Ryan's life. "I should have told you sooner," Amber whispered, her voice barely audible. "I should have told you everything." Ryan's chest tightened, the anger inside him now shifting into something more complicated, something like sorrow. He had been so focused on his own pain, so obsessed with seeking revenge, that he had failed to see the truth about Amber. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Amber. I don't know if I can forgive myself for believing you were part of this." She reached out to him, her hand trembling, but he pulled away. "You don't get to decide that. Not yet. You've hurt me too, Amber. You let it all happen." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Ryan's heart felt like it was tearing itself apart as he struggled to reconcile the person he had loved with the person standing in front of him now. He wanted to hate her, to blame her for everything, but deep down, he knew that the situation was far more complicated than either of them could have imagined. Suddenly, Amber looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Ryan, there's something else you need to know. Something I couldn't tell you before." Ryan's stomach tightened as he stared at her. "What is it?" Her voice dropped to a whisper, her words heavy with dread. "Mark is still watching us. He's been watching you, waiting for you to make a move." Ryan's blood ran cold as he realized the full extent of the trap he had walked into. Mark hadn't just orchestrated the destruction of his life, he had been playing him, pulling the strings from the shadows. And now, Mark was closing in, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. "Why didn't you warn me?" Ryan asked, his voice rising with panic. "I didn't know what he was planning. I thought it was over, but it's not." "It never was," Amber said, shaking her head. "Ryan, we need to leave. We need to get out of here now." Ryan's mind was racing, but before he could say another word, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside caught his attention. Amber's face went pale, her breath catching in her throat. "Ryan, he's here." The door burst open with a loud crash, and there, standing in the doorway, was Mark, smiling like a man who had already won. "You really thought you could get away, didn't you, Ryan?" Mark's voice was laced with malice as he stepped inside. "You were never meant to have a happy ending. None of you were?" Ryan's blood ran cold as Mark took a step closer, the malicious glint in his eyes sending a chill down his spine. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Ryan's heart raced, the adrenaline rushing through him as Mark's presence filled the room. For a split second, everything froze. The reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. Mark wasn't just a shadow from his past, he was still the mastermind behind it all. Every step Ryan had taken, every decision he'd made, had led him right into Mark's hands. Amber stood beside him, her hands trembling. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked, her voice a mixture of fear and defiance. Mark's smirk widened as he took another step forward, his eyes glinting with malicious satisfaction. "I want you both to understand something," he said slowly, savoring the moment. "This has never been about revenge. This has always been about control." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. "Control?" he spat, stepping forward, his fists clenching. "You think you control me now? After everything?" Mark laughed, a low, mocking sound that made Ryan's blood boil. "No, Ryan. Not now. Not anymore. But I did. For a long time. And I still do." He looked directly at Amber, his gaze cold and calculating. "You were never really free, Amber. You think I just let you off easy? No. You were my puppet, and so was he." Ryan turned to Amber, his mind racing. What is he talking about? Amber's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like she was going to crumble under the weight of the truth. She hesitated, but then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Mark never let me go. Even after everything, even after I tried to break free. He made sure I couldn't. He manipulated me, Ryan. He had a hold on my family. He knew everything, every secret." Ryan's world felt like it was spinning out of control. He had thought he was the one who had been manipulated, the one who had been used as a pawn, but Amber, she had been just as trapped as he was. He should have seen it. He should have known. But the blind rage, the thirst for revenge, had clouded his judgment. Mark stepped forward again, his voice dark and final. "I've been watching you both, you know. I watched you spiral, Ryan. I watched you destroy everything in your path. And all the while, you thought you were in control, but you never were. You've been playing my game all along." Ryan's pulse quickened, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. "What do you want from us, Mark?" His voice shook with a mixture of fear and anger. "Why now?" Mark's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Because, Ryan, you've finally come to the point where you're a threat. You've uncovered the truth. You've started to realize how deep this goes. And that, my friend, is something I can't allow. You're too dangerous now." Ryan felt his blood run cold as Mark stepped even closer, the tension in the room becoming unbearable. "You think you can just end it, just walk away and leave us like this?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. "You don't get to decide how this ends." "Oh, but I do," Mark replied, his smile widening. "I've always been the one with the power. And now, I'll make sure you both understand that. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Mark turned to leave, pausing at the door. "But don't worry," he added, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll both get your chance to make things right. You'll just have to figure out how." With that, he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Amber collapsed into a chair, her face pale, her eyes empty. Ryan stood frozen in place, his mind reeling from what had just happened. Mark was still out there, still pulling the strings, still controlling everything. And now, more than ever, Ryan knew that he couldn't rest until it was over. But how? How could he ever take down someone like Mark, someone who had already shown he could manipulate everyone in his life? Ryan glanced at Amber, the guilt gnawing at him. She had been as much a victim as he had, but the scars of what she had done to him, whether out of fear or manipulation, still ran deep. Could he trust her? Could they really work together to bring down the person who had torn their lives apart? Ryan didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain, this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much power Mark still held over them both. But Ryan wasn't the same person he had been 2 years ago. The rage that had once fueled him had transformed into something more focused, more dangerous. He wasn't going to let Mark win, not now, not ever. He turned to Amber, his resolve hardening. "We're not done yet. We need to find a way to take him down, once and for all." Amber looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "But how? He's always one step ahead of us. He knows everything about us." Ryan took a deep breath. "Then we need to make sure we're one step ahead of him." But as he spoke, a sudden, chilling thought crossed his mind. What if they already were? What if Mark was counting on them to follow him, to make the move he had orchestrated all along? What if the game was even more twisted than they could ever imagine? Ryan didn't know what the next step would be, but he knew he had to move fast. Time was running out. The stakes had just gotten even higher, and now, it was no longer just about revenge. It was about survival. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered, what if Mark was never the real enemy? Ryan shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He couldn't afford to doubt now. But as he turned to leave, the sound of a phone buzzing on the table caught his attention. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the screen. It was a message, from an unknown number. "You're not the only one who's been playing a game." Ryan stared at the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. The message from the unknown number echoed in his mind, each word making the ground beneath him feel even shakier. "You're not the only one who's been playing a game." He felt Amber's presence behind him, her voice barely a whisper. "Who is it?" I don't know, Ryan replied, still frozen in place. But I think we've been chasing the wrong person all along. The phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a follow-up message. Mark is only the beginning. There's someone bigger, someone you never saw coming. I've been watching you, too. Ryan's stomach twisted as a cold realization hit him. This wasn't just about Mark. Mark had been a pawn in a much larger game, a game Ryan had never even known he was a part of. The twists, the turns, the manipulation, it had all been designed to push him in one direction, but now, it felt like the pieces were finally falling into place. He quickly typed back, "Who are you?" The response was immediate, "You'll find out soon enough." But it's not just about revenge anymore. It's about control. You and Amber, your lives have been shaped by forces you'll never understand. If you want answers, you have to keep playing. Ryan's mind raced. His desire for revenge, for justice, suddenly felt insignificant. This wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. It was a dark, intricate web, and he was entangled in it whether he liked it or not. Mark had been a messenger, a catalyst. But the real threat was still out there, watching, waiting. Amber was silent for a moment, processing the gravity of what Ryan had just revealed. Who could be worse than Mark? She finally asked, her voice cracking slightly. Ryan shook his head, still unsure. I don't know, but I intend to find out. We have to stop running. We have to get to the bottom of this. There was a long pause before Amber spoke again, her voice steadier now. I don't want to be a part of this anymore, Ryan. I've done enough damage. Ryan turned to her, a strange sense of empathy flooding through him. You didn't choose this, Amber. Neither of us did. But now we're in it. We've got to finish it. Amber nodded, though the fear was still in her eyes. But how do we even start? How do we trust anything anymore? Ryan knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. The trust between them had been shattered, and the truth was more tangled than either of them could have imagined. But he also knew they didn't have a choice. Mark, the mystery figure behind the messages, whoever they were, wouldn't stop. The game wasn't over. The next few days passed in a blur. Ryan and Amber dug deeper into the past, into the shadowy corners of their lives that they had long tried to forget. They uncovered more than they ever expected, whispers of deals, hidden alliances, and a world that had existed right under their noses. But no matter how many secrets they unearthed, the one thing they couldn't escape was the looming presence of whoever was pulling the strings. And then, just as they thought they had hit a dead end, a breakthrough came. Ryan received another message, this time with a name, Victor Dane. The name meant nothing to him, but as he Googled it, the results sent a shock through his body. Victor Dane wasn't just a businessman. He was a shadow figure, a puppet master in the background of a sprawling corporate empire, pulling the strings of people like Mark for his own purposes. Ryan's blood ran cold. This was the mastermind. The one who had been playing everyone, him, Amber, even Mark. But why? What did Victor Dane want? They knew they had to confront him, but that wasn't going to be easy. Dane was a ghost, untouchable, operating from the shadows. He was the kind of man who could make you disappear with a phone call. But Ryan wasn't afraid anymore. The fear that had paralyzed him for so long had been replaced with something else, a sense of purpose, a need to take back control. The night they finally tracked down Victor Dane's location, everything seemed to fall into place. The answers they had been searching for were just out of reach, and Ryan could feel the weight of it. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about freedom, freedom from the years of manipulation, from the feeling of being powerless. He had fought so hard to regain control of his life, but it had always seemed just out of reach. Now, the time had come. When they arrived at the secluded mansion where Dane had been hiding, the tension was thick. Ryan's hands shook as he stepped out of the car, the looming presence of the building seeming to swallow the world around him. Amber walked beside him, her face set in determination. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. Inside the mansion, they found Victor Dane seated in a dimly lit room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see them. If anything, he seemed almost pleased, as if this meeting had been inevitable all along. I knew you'd come, he said, his voice smooth and cold. You two have been entertaining to watch. But now, it's time for the final act. Ryan took a step forward, his voice low but firm. You've been controlling everything. You've ruined our lives. All for what? Power? Control? You think you can just play with people's lives? Victor chuckled, setting his glass down on the table. It's never been about revenge, Ryan. It's about creating the perfect chaos. Watching people like you fight, destroy, and rebuild. You're just part of the plan. Ryan clenched his fists, his anger surging. "This ends now." For a moment, there was silence. And then, unexpectedly, Victor stood up, his expression shifting to something almost approving. "I'm done playing with you, Ryan. But you're right about one thing, it ends now. It ends with you." Before Ryan could react, two men stepped forward from the shadows, their presence unmistakable. Ryan and Amber braced themselves, knowing this wasn't over. They had made it this far, but the final confrontation had only just begun. But as the men moved to close in, something unexpected happened. Amber stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear. "We're not done yet, Victor. Not by a long shot." Victor's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sinister smile. "You think you've won?" Ryan didn't have an answer for him. But one thing was certain, the game was over, and they had finally taken control.